So, Tuesday the 31st of July, 2012. It's a night that I imagine most of you have probably long forgotten, but it's a night that I never will. Because on that night, I boarded a plane from Delhi to London. And as that plane took off, I looked out over what should have been a twinkling metropolis beneath me, but just saw darkness. And when I arrived in London, I discovered that I'd been flying over northern India as it experienced the world's largest blackout. On that night, 700 million people, that's 10% of the world's population, lost their access to electricity. And it was the front page of every newspaper when I arrived back here. But what was completely incredible to me was the fact that not a single paper, not one of them, and I kept them, mentioned the real story. The fact that not just that night, but every single night in India, another 300 to 400 million people live without access to electricity, lighting up their life with just a kerosene lantern. Now, I had been privileged enough to spend the previous 2 months with a few families, 100 or so families, in the slums of Bangalore doing my LSE master's research. And so this aha moment for me was particularly poignant. I realised that I was in what I think is my defining decade, a decade where I could truly commit myself to something that really made me tick. And that was the interconnection between climate change and poverty and what I had seen in the slums of Bangalore. And so I returned to India, and I've been based there for the last 2 years to co-found an organisation which provides a very simple solution to these dual problems, and that is solar lighting. To create an organisation that was like an Avon for solar lighting in India's urban slums. And I'm here today to talk to you about social entrepreneurship and what it might mean for your defining decades. But before I do, let me take you back to where it all started for me and introduce you to Bhima. Now, Bhima was one of the first women that I got to meet in the urban slums that I worked in, and this is her and her family. Now, Bhima lived in a home that is not much bigger than your dining room table. It's made of bamboo poles and covered in a tarpaulin sheet. And her home is surrounded by those of her friends and neighbours who have all come from their native places, from rural areas around Bangalore to the city to find work, to become what has been named the invisible city makers of the cosmopolitan cities of the next century. Now, Bhima's community is right in the centre of the city. It is surrounded by big roads, cars and buildings, and very ironically, electricity wires run over the roof of her house. But none will actually ever come to her home. And that, as I said, is because Bhima lives in an urban slum in India. And when the lights go off for India, it's when the sun goes down. And what happens is her home will rapidly fill with smoke from the kerosene light that she uses for light and the open wood fire she uses for cooking. Now, Bhima knew this wasn't good for her and her family because they would cough and cry from the smoke, and I couldn't even enter her home while she was cooking. But what she didn't realise is it's the second largest killer of women and children in India, and equivalent to 2 packs of cigarettes a day. So, faced with these amazing women like Bhima and her family, I had 2 very compelling reasons to do something about this. There was the macro reason around climate change, and I knew that getting rid of kerosene lanterns was one of the lowest hanging fruits to reducing climate change. But there was also a very micro reason to help the health and well-being of Bhima and her family. And so we decided to return to India, and I co-founded Pollinate Energy with a couple of wonderful friends of mine. And we all gave up our careers in photovoltaic engineering for me and as a renewable energy advisor to put our skills to much better use. But we faced quite a few problems when we started to do this. The first one, as I'm sure quite a few can attest, was we didn't have very much money. I had been a student like many of you, and so our pot of funds was around $50,000. That was all of our combined life savings. And we realised that if we just gave away solar lights to the people living in these urban slums, we could maybe touch the lives of a few thousand people. But if we created a social enterprise where we got Beamer to pay back her solar light in just what she was paying for kerosene every week, then we could reinvest that money and provide solar lights, hopefully, to millions of people across the country. And so that's exactly what we did. But we had another realisation, another problem, that we were a few kids from the West. What were we to know? We really needed to tap into the incredible entrepreneurial skill pool there is in India. And so we decided to train up local entrepreneurs. And these are our first entrepreneurs, our first 5. We launched them at the start of 2013. And they are incredible young entrepreneurs, and they form a trusted connection between Pollinate Energy and the communities that we serve. Each pollinator gets trained up by our head office and then goes out to the region that they know best and serves the slums in that region. Each region usually has about 30 slums, and within each slum there can be anywhere between 10 and 500 households. And so we created an Avon for solar lighting in urban slums. But we faced another problem. We couldn't do this alone. And so we called for the best and brightest young fellows from around the world to help us train up these pollinators. And they came in droves. And this was one of our groups from November. And they work with our pollinators in their first month to launch their businesses and act as a team of complete moral support while they're doing this. And because of their help and the amazing work of our pollinators, we've been able to grow over 1,000% and do so much more than we ever thought we'd be able to in 1 year. We wanted to touch 30 communities. We're now working in over 300. We wanted to influence the lives of maybe 1,000 people. We're now working with over 14,000. And in so doing, we've reduced the emissions of over 200,000 kilograms of CO2. And because of this, we have some pretty high hopes for the future. We want to be in every Tier 1 city by 2020. Now, India is a huge country. That's 53 cities. But because of the incredible support of our fellows and our volunteers, we think we can do this. Now, I told you today that I'm here to talk to you about social entrepreneurship. And my story, this story is just one of so many that I have met and heard over this last year. I believe that we are entering into an incredible new dawn for social entrepreneurship. And I've met social entrepreneurs all over the world who are using their new ideas with the skills and technology that you and I know so well, and I know you've all used Facebook, to do things and to solve problems that haven't been able to be solved by the big corporations and institutions that have existed in our world to date. But I've also recognised that for a lot of you, you are in what I think is your defining decade. The 10 years in your life where you no longer have responsibilities to your family and friends and their ambitions from you because you're about to leave university, but nor do you have responsibilities of a family of your own. And you can truly dedicate a decade to doing something real about an issue that you really care about. Now, I am just at the start of my journey as a social entrepreneur, but I have had the complete honour of being able to mentor and meet a lot of young people who are about to step up and step off onto this journey. And I've recognised that there are 3 main myths that stop people from doing this. And I think if we can talk about those and get over those, we will make some big headway in starting to solve some of these big problems. And they are that you don't think you have an original, cool, sexy idea, that you don't have the skills right now to do it, and that choosing a career path that is different from your mentors and the world architects of yesterday is a scary, bad thing to do. So let me talk to you about those. The first one, you don't think you have an original, sexy idea. Now, I really get this, because when I returned to India, I really wanted to just create a cool new solar light. Surely, if we could just invent a great solar light, we could solve this problem. But what we realised, and what you'll find if you talk to anybody who is working in provision of essential services or vaccinations or contraception or solar lighting to the people at the bottom of the pyramid, it's that very often it is not a technology problem. It is a distribution problem, and that's exactly what we found. And so we had to find an innovative solution to a distribution problem, as I said, to become an Avon of solar lighting. And that wasn't new and that wasn't innovative, but it was applied to a context that really needed doing, and so it was worth it. Now, the other big problem with this idea of having a great, sexy idea is that people say you need to believe in it from day one. And that is really hard, because I can attest on day one you are trying it out, and most likely you are failing. We failed so much in our first days that we started calling it pivoting instead of failing, because we were saying it so often. And that's a really important part of the process. And it wasn't until we opened up applications to fellows from around the world, and I started to get letters from these wonderful young people who believed in what we were doing and believed in us, that I also started to believe in us. And then things really started to happen. So don't worry about having the newest, coolest, sexiest idea, or even in believing in it on day one. That all will come. Now, the second big myth is that you don't have the skills right now. Now, if India has taught me anything, it has taught me that if you can paint a sign, you can be a social entrepreneur. Even better, if you can push a pushcart which looks quite a lot more like a high school project than a social enterprise, you can be a social entrepreneur. Most of the skills that you use on a daily basis, you'll have been using since you were 10 years old. So don't worry. And not only that, our generation has a whole nother set of skills that we've talked about today, which I think are the clincher for how we're going to solve some of these problems. And that is our knowledge and understanding of technology, both web and phone-based. Now, if somebody had told me before starting a social enterprise that my knowledge of Facebook was an asset for my career, I surely would have laughed at them. Surely knowing how to use Facebook makes you less efficient in the workplace. But when I did an audit very recently of the amount of web and phone-based applications we use to run our enterprise on a daily basis, it was over 30. We used online crowdfunding to raise our first $10,000. We use Google Maps to find and map the urban slums across all the cities that we're about to enter. And most importantly, when we realised we were reaching a capacity limit, because every solar light we put in, we had to use 5 forms, we developed a phone application. An application where all of our pollinators could drop GPS trackers, do surveys, send SMS receipts, take photos of their customers, and we could see what they were doing in real time. So the application of this technology and the apps that we use every day, has allowed us to scale our operations over a whole country. And these technologies weren't even available 3 to 5 years ago. So the skills are there and you already have them. And the final issue around your skills is you don't need to have them all anyway. We live in the era of networking, and it's not just social networking. We decided from the very beginning that we didn't have all the skills, and so we opened it up, our organisation up to all the incredible skills of our young professionals and fellows. And because of them, we've been able to do so much more than we ever thought. We're about to start supplying smoke-reducing cook stoves, sanitary napkins, and over the last month, a group of our fellows had been working on a demountable house made out of recycled plastic bags from the rag pickers that we work with. They're incredible skills and ideas, and we didn't need to have them all ourselves. Now, the last big myth, and I think it's probably the most important, that you think you need to follow the career path of your mentors and your heroes and the world architects of yesterday if you want to make a big mark on tomorrow. Now, I really realised this was not true from a very personal experience. Now, I told you that I decided when I stepped off that plane to start a social enterprise, but I also made a call to a mentor of mine, a mentor who I had hoped to have a career very similar to. She had been in consulting, then in investment banking, got onto the board of a company she wanted to influence and influenced them very effectively, and then went on to start an organisation of her own. And I called her up and I said, you know, I've just been offered this great job, which I had been here in London, but my heart is really in starting this social enterprise. What do you think? And she said to me, you know what, Kat? If you came to me in a few years after starting this social enterprise and doing your PhD, there's no way that I would employ you. And of course, all of my fears of never being employable again came rushing back. But then she said to me, but if I look around at the young people who are changing the world today, they are tackling old, big problems with new ideas and new skills and technology and access to funding that I didn't have even 5 years ago. So it probably doesn't matter if I would employ you. What matters more is if you would consider employing me. And so in that one instant, I realized that because of my generation and my passions and my skill set, I was going to do something very different from the path of my mentors and my hero. And I had to come to terms with that. So today I have taught you about these 3 big myths and busted them, I hope. That you certainly have good ideas, that you know good ideas because a lot of the great ones aren't original. That you have the skills. If you can paint a sign, if you can use Facebook, if you can ask your friends for help, you have the skills. But that you may need to consider using them in a way that you didn't expect, outside of the organisations and the institutions and the corporations that you originally expected to change the world through. And if I haven't been able to convince you by busting those 3 myths, then let me tell you one last story that convinced me. And it takes me right back to the beginning, to when I stepped off that plane. And I told you that that was my aha moment, but that's not quite true. There was a moment in between saying no to that job and saying yes to buying my ticket back to India that I completely freaked out. I had just given up on my career path that I had been sailing happily down to chase something I knew I cared about deeply but couldn't see the end goal of yet. And I had a very good friend of mine sit me down and say this. He said, Kat, you had the biggest dreams. You were going to change the world. And you went to the right school. And then you went to the right university and you met the right guy and you took the right job and you got the right promotions. And then all of a sudden, you were 30 or 35 or 40 and you were too afraid to step off. And so he said to me, Kat, won't you please step off? And so I will say to you all today that we have some huge problems to solve, but that you have fantastic ideas and that you certainly have the skills and the technology of our generation, but that you may need to consider doing it in a way that you never expected to before. And that in order to step up and solve some of these big problems, you may need to consider stepping off. Thank you.